It changed the course of South African history, the 1976 Soweto Uprising, when police opened fire on school children protesting against a racist education system. But 40 years later, what does it mean for a new generation of young South Africans? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. It's considered a turning point in the long struggle against apartheid in South Africa. On June 16, 1976, school children took to the streets of Soweto to protest against a decision that would force them to be taught in Afrikaans. That was, of course, the language of their oppressors. And schools for black children were already in a dismal state, intentionally overcrowded and under-resourced. So it was under these conditions that the students protested on that day 40 years ago. And in response, consistent with the way the apartheid government repressed dissent, police opened fire on the young protesters. Officially, 170 students were killed, but many put that figure as high as 700 in the subsequent violence that followed. It became known as the Soweto Uprising and led to other protests across the country. Now, one of the first to fall was 13-year-old Hector Peterson, seen here. This photo became the iconic image of the Soweto Uprising, and it would go on to have a huge impact, prompting outrage around the world. Now, a former student who took part in the Soweto Uprisings 40 years ago took us back to that day. He walked along the path of the march he helped organize and told us his story in his own words.
My name is Seth Mazibuko. I'm from Soweto. I'm still a Soweto boy, and I was one of the student leaders in 1976. I was part of the action committee that planned and led 1976 student uprisings in Soweto. We did not plan the killing of children by their fathers. We planned a march that was to be peaceful. But the attack became very violent, and about 300 to so number of young people were killed on the day. Behind the first group of students that were marching, then the police were following them from behind. Slowly the police, as they were parking there and as we were turning around and raising our fingers with the sign of peace, they threw tear gas canisters to us. You don't punish 13-year-olds with a gun. You punish those, even if there was going to be a confrontation, we thought at least a whip, batons and all that. But now to actually mow them down in guns, I can't forgive them. Sorry, I'm still angry, I'm still bitter, and particularly when I think that now, when I look around and still see that some of the things that we fought for haven't changed.
Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's show. In Johannesburg, Noor Nieftagodien, South Africa Research Chair at the University of Witwatersrand. In Pretoria, Somadoda Fikeni, Policy and Political Scientist at the University of South Africa. And also in Johannesburg, Simamkele Dlakavu, a student activist for the movement Fees Must Fall. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Simamkele in Joburg, if I can start with you. Soweto, of course, has come to symbolize the role young people have played in shaping the political discourse in South Africa. As a young black South African, what does Soweto mean to you?
Soweto means to us black revolt, black youth-led revolt. We need to look at the context that Soweto rose from. Political movements, political parties such as the ANC and the PAC were banned at that time, as well as political leaders were sent to prison, were killed or were exiled. So young people had to lead themselves at that moment. So for us as young people who are involved in the decolonization movements and the movements that are calling for an end to commodified education, we are inspired by black resistance that is youth-led.
You say you're inspired, but I wonder, do all your peers, do all young South Africans understand the importance of Soweto? Do they care about the Soweto Uprising?
I think I definitely cannot speak for all young South Africans. I can speak for the young South Africans who are part of our movements, and who I interact with daily, they definitely see it as a key turning point. A lot of political scientists view Soweto and June 16 as a place or a moment where young people filled a political vacuum. Like many have said, at that time, in the political status quo in the country, there was a vacuum, there was silence. So young people were able to feel that and put pressure on that apartheid government for it to finally fall in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay, Noor Nieftagodien in Johannesburg. I imagine that even those who were there in 1976 were affected differently. So I wonder, what does Soweto mean to South Africa in general today?
I think absolutely. It's important to remember that the Soweto Uprising that spread very quickly across the country was a fundamental turning point. It shattered the political quiescence of the 1960s, and together with the Workers' Uprising in 1973, inaugurated what became the anti-apartheid movement inside the country. It also inaugurated the Township Uprising that reached a high point in the 1980s. So from the vantage point of today, it's important to remember and acknowledge that that movement was the real beginning of the end of apartheid. It was the real beginning of the internal liberation movement. I think secondly, it's important to remember, as Simamkele has said, that young black people, and these students who marched on June 16th were aged 10, 11 to 18 years old. And they marched because they wanted a decent education. They saw education as a means of advancing themselves, so that the imposition of Afrikaans posed a fundamental blockage on their ability to advance themselves as young black people. But of course, it was not only against the imposition of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. As you said in your introduction, it was also a rebellion against Bantu education, and beyond that, a rebellion against the apartheid system. And I think the kind of core lesson that it holds for young people who are still faced in many instances with an education system that excludes and marginalizes young, poor black people, that in fact, young black people can take the future into their own hands if they unite amongst themselves. And perhaps, if I could end up on this point, very importantly, one of the key lessons of 76 was that young black people united with their parents and workers to challenge the system. And that is what confronts young black people today as well.
Somadoda Fikeni, there is, of course, the issue of education, which is still present today and which people like Simamkele are protesting for today, better education for young black South Africans. So, you know, it begs the question, what has changed and what hasn't changed then in South Africa since 1976, if people are still protesting about the same issue today?
Well, I do think that what has changed is that apartheid in its formal sense has been removed and a new democratic system is in place. But 20 years on, or 22 years after our freedom, what is quite clear is that the socio-economic conditions have not been transformed as they should. And as such, this is impacting negatively on the youth. Whether you talk unemployment, poverty, you talk HIV/AIDS, violent crime, crisis in education, the people who tend to suffer most are the youth. And yet this is happening at the time when they are at the height of their aspirations.
So can you then still talk about a form of apartheid in South Africa today when it comes to education?
To some degree, whilst the apartheid system has been removed, you do have free access. If you have not attended to the socio-economic structural issues, it simply means that the race factor is still as important for the people who have not been able to access opportunities and resources. Therefore, they find themselves squeezed. But there is another dimension, though. Whilst government has done a lot in providing financial aid schemes, these tend to target the poorest of the poor. And then you do have a layer which is said now to be the missing link of children of lower middle class, such as teachers, nurses, who have very low salary, who are not qualifying to get this financial aid and loan systems, not in the government student financial aid scheme and not in the banks. And most of these students are the ones who feel most vulnerable and are the ones who are leading some of the marches.
I want to bring in Simamkele once again about what you've been protesting about, the education, better education for all. Do you feel like the government today is more responsive to your demands than it was back in 1976 when the Soweto Uprisings were happening?
It's very ironic to me that our government today celebrates June 16. It's something that shouldn't be celebrated. In their attempts to whitewash this day, they celebrate it. They make it a music festival or to depoliticize this day so that young people forget to see the correlations of this day and the struggles that young people or young students are facing today. For instance, young people who protested during Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, and the end of outsourcing, which is an exploitative labor system that's targeted or that affects majority Black workers. When young people were engaging in that form of protest, they were arrested, they were beaten up, they were tear gassed, they were suspended and were expelled. As we speak today, there are young people in different parts of the country at different universities that are suspended from school and expelled from school because of their activism. So for me, what this government has shown us is that it has no tolerance for protest. It's not even not only shown students, but it has shown people, for instance, like mine workers who were shot, for demanding a living wage. There's an activist called Andrew Statane who was shot a few years ago for demanding water. So a lot of young activists call South Africa, this democratic South Africa, as a post-apartheid state, saying that there's not much change that has happened in terms of structurally. So still, for instance, as an Oxfam report mentions that 2 white men own the same wealth as the bottom half of the population. As well as white businesses still get allowed with the same corruption that they were. For instance, Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do want to bring up the point of police brutality, which you alluded to when you mentioned the mine workers. And everyone, of course, remembers Marikana in 2012 when miners were shot, were beaten by police. Noor Nieftagodien in Johannesburg. There are some who say that police brutality in South Africa today is at the same level as it was back in the 1970s, back in 1976. Do you think that's the reality or an exaggeration, in your opinion?
I think that the way to address that question is, first of all, to say that the white police and the apartheid police were particularly brutal. Many hundreds of people were killed in 1976 as well as in the 1980s. So at one level, what we don't see today is the same level of fatal violent intervention by the security forces. Mm-hmm. However, as Simamkele has said, what one continues to witness, particularly in relation to protests, is one, a concerted effort by the authorities to criminalize protests, wherever that takes place, be it in the rural areas, by students, by workers, and the like. And what that has generated is a kind of impunity by the police to act violently against protests. So any kind of protest is criminalized and therefore legitimizes violence against protesters. So I think that one has to be careful not to equate directly the violence of the current regime with the violence of the apartheid state. Nonetheless, I think that the perspective that one should have on this is, if one is a poor black person living in a shack settlement, there are various kinds of violence. There's a direct violence perpetrated by the police and other security forces. but there's also the violence of poverty, the violence of marginalization, of unemployment. And the fact that that kind of violence has continued is an indictment on the current status quo.
That's interesting what you say there, but when you hear the opposition economic freedom fighters, the EFF and Julius Malema, Somadoda Fikeni in Pretoria, say that, 20 years into democracy in South Africa and the police is still killing people. I know it's an election year, of course, and that you can sort of expect to hear this sort of rhetoric. But is Julius Malema right? Do you agree with the fact that there is still violence today, Somadoda Fikeni, in South Africa? Violence perhaps to the same levels as in 1976?
Well, I would not equate, as Nick was saying, the apartheid time of violence when it was sanctioned by the state. In nowadays, what you see are the policemen and women who are poorly trained for the crowd control at times, faced with protest and political protest, which are ever increasing in numbers, and they are quite strained in many ways. And as such, of course, leading to elections, you will have some exaggeration by all political parties making claims as to what the situation is. It's a lot more complex picture. Indeed, what is happening today in terms of protests is a disappointment of people who thought that a free South Africa would immediately address socio-economic inequalities and injustices.
Okay.
And that has not happened, obviously.
Okay.
And the economy is struggling. And
Right.
therefore, you do have these particular protests which are straining the police who are already spread so thin in an environment which is a human rights environment in terms of the laws, but in terms of practice, they are not equipped for that.
I want to bring back Noor Nieftagodien in Johannesburg now, because I want to talk about the Black consciousness movement, this concept of being aware and proud of being Black, which played, of course, a huge role in the struggle for liberation in South Africa. It's a movement that wasn't started, surprisingly, by the African National Congress. And Soweto, in fact, was a real product of the Black consciousness movement and its organizations. I wonder today, is there still a meaning? Does the Black consciousness movement still resonate in today's South Africa?
I think it's a fascinating question and very interesting that amongst the students of today, there has been a revival of Black consciousness. And I think there are probably two overarching reasons for that. The first is, you can take any indicator of underdevelopment in South Africa, and those indicators will show very clearly that the questions of economic deprivation and race coincide very fundamentally. Poor Black people continue to suffer in multiple ways. And therefore, when one looks at South Africa and you try to understand the nature of the problems, you can't escape the fact that it's Black people who continue to suffer. And secondly, I think one of the important messages of Black consciousness amongst many is a kind of powerful sense of self-pride, of determination, of fearlessness. And I think that what the new generation of student activists have drawn on from Black consciousness is both an understanding of the problems of society, as well as drawing on the kind of inspiration, the ideological, philosophical inspiration that has been bequeathed to them by Black consciousness. I'm not surprised at all that today Black consciousness continues to have resonance, and in fact I would suggest is gaining significant traction amongst a new generation of young Black people, including young Black intellectuals.
Well,
like
let's ask the new generation. Simamkele, what does Black consciousness mean to you, and what impact do you see it having on the political scene in South Africa? Because for right now, even though Noor says it's making a comeback, it seems that it's almost non-existent on the political scene in South Africa.
I think it is existent in the political scene in South Africa, and it's evident.
But where are the Black consciousness parties that we saw back in the 1970s? Where are those parties today?
Obviously, those parties are not here today, or they are fractured, or they are divided and don't have traction. But for instance, in my political home, the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, we are very clear on our mandate for Black liberation, Black justice, and taking back our land. And those are some of the principles of Black consciousness. With what I feel very uncomfortable about how Black consciousness philosophy is represented in post-apartheid South Africa, it's represented in the media, is a sort of whitewashing of Black consciousness. Mm-hmm. So for instance, a lot of people place a lot of emphasis on Black psychological emancipation, Black pride, but Black consciousness was much about the internal as external political change. Black consciousness called for the taking back of the land that was stolen from Black people. Black consciousness spoke about taking back the mineral wealth of this country and giving it to Black people. So Black consciousness is so holistic, and we've seen with how young people have used it. For instance, the Roads Must Fall, if you read the Roads Must Fall manifesto, it quotes Steve Biko directly. If you see, for instance, the buildings that have been renamed by the students themselves, at the beginning of this year, the University of Free States, young people had led a protest there. Right. And they took down the names of their oppressors. And there was a Steve Biko Auditorium, Winnie Mandela building, for instance. And those are the principles of Black consciousness and decolonization.
Okay, let me bring in Somadoda Fikeni in Pretoria now. Somadoda, what can today's young South Africans, this new generation, the Simamkeles and others, what can they learn from the Soweto generation?
There is a number of lessons that they can learn. One of those is the notion of self-reliance and community involvement, which was quite dominant in the Black consciousness movement of the 70s. And the other one is sheer clarity in terms of the alternative to what you are trying to oppose and put aside. Because very much...
Are you saying that there's no clarity? Are you saying that, I mean, despite all the protests and so on, there's no clarity, there's no solutions that they're offering?
What the emphasis, there are solutions they're offering, but I don't see the detail. For example, when you talk of Roads Must Fall, at least in the public perception, it has emphasized on names that must come down. It has emphasized on the statues that must come down, but the core issues of the transformation of the curriculum, of the nature of education in the public discourse are not well articulated. They may be there in the documents somewhere, but in the public discourse, the main emphasis is on what must fall. Same with the insourcing, for example.
Let's allow Simamkele to respond, because I'm seeing that she's disagreeing with you there. He says that, you know, what we're hearing today is a lot of complaining and not necessarily solutions from the young Black South Africans. What do you respond, Simamkele?
I think it's very unfair because in making that assumption is that you don't interrogate the power structures that be and the media in South Africa that communicates the inputs by the students. Obviously, the media in South Africa will want to communicate the sensationalism about our movements, will want to communicate the protests, but they will not want to give us space and platforms to talk about the ideas that we have about the country going forward. For instance, when young people are calling for buildings and statues to fall, they are rising up Pan-Africanist names of people that should be celebrated. Secondly, I just need to make this quick point. In 2014, a group of politics postgraduate students, a group of us created a 12,000 word document critiquing the curriculum, and we offered alternative courses. We even, not only did we describe the courses that we want to learn, but we described the authors that are already doing this kind of work, not only in the African continent, but in the diaspora. So I think it's very unfair for that comment to be made, is because on our social media platforms, on our websites, we clearly state the solutions that we look forward to.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I wish we had more time to continue this fascinating discussion. Thank you so very much for speaking to us, Noor Nieftagodien, Simamkele Dlakavu, and Somadoda Fikeni. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Of course, our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.